Pomelo is a short fiction story that attempts to confront the familial relationship between women, specifically through the introduction of a new sibling, the sickness and death of a mother, and a discovery of a deeply rooted connection to ancestry. This reading is a small excerpt from this work that begins on page 10 and continues to the narrative's conclusion. The pomelo trees then began to shift and move, their branches stretching as if just awoken from a long nap. In the moonlight that intensified and reflected from within the leaves, figures began to emerge from the trees. Their shapes flickered and rippled like the surface of water, a blue hue shimmering from each out into the night air. Eve walked among them, leaving the base of the tree from which the panther sat. The figures mingled, touching hands and shoulders, moving under and among the branches. Eve tried to catch their faces, but their movements were too quick and uncertain. Their eyes, however, were kind and smiling, as they flickered within and without of Eve's vision. Their cheeks were thin and high. They were women's faces and women's bodies, which danced and celebrated in one another's presence. The women climbed the branches of the trees with ease and tossed pomelos to those who waited below. The citrus was split and shared among the women, who pulled the fruit from the rinds with their teeth and spit the seeds back to the earth. Eve stared, twisting and turning as the women moved past and around her. Reaching out to touch their glowing figures, her hands passed instead through cold air. One woman broke off from the group. Swaying, she moved towards the trees from which Eve had been standing. Eve watched as the woman crouched down to the swaddled blanket. Her blue hand reached down and untucked the fabric. Small, short fingers squirmed, reaching up and grabbing onto the woman's pinky. Gentle laughter escaped from the woman's figure. The glow that surrounded her buzzed in response. She picked the baby up from where it lay, situated between the roots of the trees, and held it lovingly within her arms as if it were her own. The women gathered around the baby, buzzing with the sound that resembled a woman's voice. They passed the baby from one another, each nuzzling their faces into the blanket or holding the small hands within their own. The baby seemed to be drifting away, moving as easily as if it were being carried downstream. Wait! Eve stumbled in the dark towards the glowing figures. Their light began to flicker, and their figures grew less defined. They began to step back beneath the leaves and through the branches, disappearing from where they had emerged in the pomelo trees. The final figure, with the baby still cradled in her arms, looked up from the baby to Eve, who stood a few feet away. "Wait," Eve pleaded, her voice weak. The woman approached Eve and without a word placed her sister in her arms. Their eyes met briefly. Something familiar flickered within the blue countenance that rippled before her. The fleeting smile and smiling eyes resembled her mother, but before Eve could speak, the figure's gentle hands pushed the baby closer to Eve's chest, and she disappeared. The panther eased slowly over to Eve, circled around her legs, and sat down at her right side. "Life cannot be traded, Eve," it said, shouldering Eve so that she stumbled in the direction of the porch lights that flickered in the distance. "Care and nurture your sister as you do the pomelo trees, as your mother cared for you." With the seed of a pomelo, a new tree was planted at the edge of the garden by a pair of small, guided hands. As time passed and the seed sprouted, pushing its way up from the familiar soil and opening its leaves into the sun, the old porch swing slowly grew crowded as the space that divided the two sisters was mended. With her sister's head resting on her shoulder, Eve pushed her feet against the faded surface of the deck. The paint chipped and wood softened from the many soles which rocked the swing before. The sapling continued to grow, its branches spreading outward like arms opening for an embrace, its leaves cupped as if catching the sunlight in their center. As the weather began to warm and the songbirds announced the beginning of spring, the tree began to flower. When its first pomelo ripened, smooth and yellow, it was picked from its branches and carried inside to be carved and prepared. The juices dripped from the kitchen counter down the two girls' forearms. The earthy smell of dirt and the bright scent of citrus mingled throughout the house. As they, together, admired the full-grown tree which stood proudly at the edge of the garden, Eve peeled the pith from the pomelo with care and passed a slice to her sister. That evening, when the sun cast across the horizon the same pink found at the center of the ripest fruit, as they shared and sucked from the sweetest-tasting citrus, so sweet even, that the rind could be chewed before it was candied and the preserves tasted as sweet as jelly, Eve told her sister of the women of the pomelo trees.